Okay. Permission again from the panel? Okay, good. Starting my speech in three, two, and one. A few pieces of contextualization before argumentation. First of all, then, what does protectionism look like? Is the imposition of tariffs, embargoes, quotas, or taxes on imports, while also giving subsidies to domestic industries, with the sole purpose to shield domestic industries from low-cost manufacturing. Now, note that currently developed countries themselves do not follow their own principle of free trade and apply protectionism to their own countries. This can look like the US on agricultural goods. This can look like China placing quotas on imports. This can also look like the EU placing tariffs on non-EU countries to begin with. What then are developing countries? These are countries whose primary sector is based on industries which are heavily reliant on things like agriculture, mineral resource extraction, or even animal farming. Note that these countries rely on imports for machinery, electronic equipment, luxury consumer goods like iPhones or plastic articles. Well, another thing to note is that underdeveloped production processes are based on human labor, whereas the vast rural areas which function on self-sustainability models, for example, cottage industries in Naran, they sell small-scale consumer goods to tourists, but in the current status quo, they're being overtaken by cheap Chinese imports. But what then will the opposition's alternative be? It's going to be the current status quo where free trade is preferred, which refers to the free movement of goods, capital, and labor across borders. First argument then about the development of phone industries. There are two major types of industries that exist in developing countries, i.e., sunrise industries and strategic industries. Sunrise industries are those industries that have recently been established and are just starting to develop, plus they're less competitive. Strategic industries are those that the country is very reliant on. So, for instance, agriculture and military equipment. These are industries which a country would not want to be reliant on imports for, since global trade fluctuations which happen could impact them a lot. How do we then develop these industries through protectionism? First idea then, by providing them with cost benefits through two ways. First, A, by imposing tariffs due to which the imports per unit cost to the consumer rises. This shifts their consumption to cheaper alternatives. So, for example, Nutella versus a cheaper alternative. B, by providing these industries with subsidies through things like tax breaks or funding, in which you directly lower the cost of production for these industries, which they then have an incentive to pass on to the consumer to capture a greater share of the consumer base. Second idea then about fighting off image benefits of goods from the global norm. Note that in a lot of instances, domestic private companies that provide alternative goods, they are deemed to be of lesser quality, even if that is not the case. This is due to the idea about marketing and conspicuous consumption, wherein you associate a better image with the consumption of a certain product, not for the actual product quality reasons. The biggest example in the status quo is iPhone and other luxury consumer goods. We fight this off by increasing the prices of these goods to the extent that domestic goods become more favorable or at least a viable alternative for people to do this. Note the impact of all of this is that the consumption for these industries then increase, which means that they're better able to sustain themselves and develop over time to have more machinery. Instead of being drained out, for example, is a person in Iran whose only access to economic opportunity comes through selling basic consumer goods or Oppo phones in Pakistan, whereas a country is able to capture and capitalize a market base that is theirs. Second argument then about how free trade harms developing countries' mode of output. Note that the premise of this argument is that through free trade, developing countries remain entrenched in the primary sector. Why? Because of multiple reasons. Number one, there is a colonial legacy existing, whereas colonial extraction models were set in a way that they used to extract resources and only send them to the colonial country in nature. Whereas the entire infrastructure system was developed for export reasons, but not for the reasons of development of the country. Whereas these colonial countries suppressed local industries to the point they destroyed it just to maintain complete control over the country. Or even monoculture economies, which were encouraged, whereas you only focused on one specialized area like crops and nothing else, which means that these countries had no development of any industries at all, which would always mean that these countries would always be behind in terms of production until and unless we implement protectionist policies to repair this damage. Because you need to note that there's a comparative advantage lock-in system in place, because free trade only promotes specialized products in the primary sector, but these developed countries are always specialized in high quality products. They will always have an advantage. And the thing you need to note is that all of your secondary and tertiary sectors are left underdeveloped due to historical injustices to do so, which means they will never
UI.
get that advantage. Third of all, then about there being a global supply chain dependency, and last of all, the idea about trade policies and tariffs remaining asymmetric. Note that global north puts tariffs on things like agriculture and crops, but they don't put tariffs on things like raw materials because they use them themselves. This leads to the global north market always remaining uncompetitive, where for your developing countries, there will always be cheap exports existing, cheap exports, but always expensive imports to do so. This leads to things like a trade deficit existing. The problem which begins is that now it puts pressure on a country's payment, which a country has to do, especially if these imports are done in thing or in other currencies, which are way more stable than your own currency to begin with. This exact thing leads to developing countries reliance on debt to do so, which they're never able to pay off, and they always exist for generations and generations because of the vast majority or the amount of this debt within the current status quo. Hence, we think that their output is damaged to a further extent without this protectionist policy. Third argument then about employment being generated. Note that when your domestic industry is growing, you will have various new businesses and companies setting up industries and offices within your country because there's room for development and there is room for profit existing. And in the previous model, these companies face insane amounts of competition from foreign imports that were produced at a cheaper cost, which they were never able to compete with, such as Chinese products in Pakistan. Now, note that these products, since they don't enter the market, existing businesses are much better off as they now have the capacity to operate freely and thus will expand within the country. In the absence of this protectionism, local industries were literally going bankrupt and had to fire employees at a massive scale. But now in our world, when you have protectionist policies existing, these industries are much more likely to employ more individuals because the environment becomes more favorable for local industries. It is likely that they expand, and this is why they will start and employ more people from within the country. It's not just about direct employment, but even indirect employment that is generated as a result of increased business activities within your country, such as construction workers who help build the factories or the direct employees of businesses now using drivers, etc. Secondly, considering the population density of these developing countries, they usually have a huge market which is underdeveloped. This is why once trade embargoes and tariffs are placed on foreign companies and MNCs, they will not wish to lose this immensely large consumer base and will begin setting up businesses and factories in these developing countries to bypass policies of protectionism. This has happened in India within the past, and it leads to a larger amount of employment or for individuals from the developing country, which not only caters to the only skilled workers but also unskilled workers through things like indirect employment. So, in turn, we generally think that even in our worst case, there is still more employment existing on our side because to bypass these protectionist policies and to bypass these extremely high prices of tariffs, these foreign companies and MNCs will eventually have to set up companies within their own country. Hence, we think on a practical level, since you've told you all of the benefits that the country will be better off, the people will be better off, and there will be more sustainable growth for the country, please vote for team proposition.
Thank you for that fine speech. First, we now have first member of opposition, please.
Assalamu alaikum. Daniel phone. Where? Leave my phone close. Thank you. I'll be starting in before that, POI is in the chat probably. Probably. Chair, sorry. Okay. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. The reason I think they fall at first is because the language their argumentation entails or resorts to are a series of ambiguities that I believe are undecidable for them. A few key rebuttals to their argumentation then. Firstly, they talk about how you're going to subsidize some industries and also place quotas, etc. And both of these things are going to happen simultaneously. I believe that is untrue because no, you cannot subsidize industries because that also requires you to have money and also place quotas, etc. at the same time. Because when you do place those quotas, etc., you're going to ruin your relationship with those external actors that are funding in that money or rolling in that cash in your country to begin with. So I think that was an untrue premise to begin with because you lack money. That is why you are a developing country to begin with. But then they also talk about how you're going to have local alternatives that are going to be so better for you and so harmonious for you. That relies on two premises. Number one, their argument relied on two premises. Number one, you only relied on luxury goods from these developed countries, which I think is firstly untrue because no, you also rely on a lot of other things, a lot of capital industry that comes from these developed countries, etc. The capital machinery that comes in from the developed countries, etc. as well. But secondly, it relied on the premise that you have local alternatives to begin with. Understand the reason you are interdependent on each other is because no country is completely self-sufficient to begin with. So both those premises were very untrue. So local alternatives being so better and even existing in the first place is something that is untrue from the very get-go. But understand the devastation by virtue of your short-term impacts that they have on their side of the house is so bad. But then they also talk about how global supply chain dependency is like happening on our side, and but they never talk to us about how that's bad. Because understand, I believe it's not bad because it helps maintain developed countries be more interdependent on you, right? So it maintains that relationship, it maintains that for both developed and developing countries. So I do not see how that global supply chain was bad to begin with. But then moving on to my key, context for within this debate, understand what developing countries look like, right? These are countries with probably weak economies that cannot self-sustain themselves. This is why they are developing countries to begin with. I don't think I need to explain that in detail. But secondly, there are also countries that have corrupted and weak systems of governance. That is because of the amount of money these countries have. That is also by the reason they remain these developing countries to begin with, because they aren't able to fix up those economic issues due to the political issues that exist in these countries to begin with. But then thirdly, also understand how they also have a high need for international assistance or money to begin with in the first place. But then towards my first line of argument. My first line of argument then is how it deteriorates your relationship with key countries, harming both development and devastating your economy in the shorter term and longer term. Let's talk about developed countries first, and then we'll be going on to developing countries. Let's talk about developed countries. Why do we rely on these developed countries to begin with? Let's understand that. You rely on developed countries because you require loans from them. You require aid from them because you do not have money in your country to begin with. But also understand you simply rely on them so you do not go out to default as a country. That is why Pakistan just goes on and becomes more and more dependent, right? But then also, you also need them for your own indigenous industries as well, because they pool in the money to sustain your indigenous industries as well. But then thirdly, also understand how developed countries have major voting rights in international organizations, which also give them a key role in which sense you need to maintain a good relationship with these developed countries as well. But also understand the money that they give us to be developed, etc., is also very good. For example, we have an example of Rwanda, where your surgical industry, an industry which is very specific and niche, was developed by virtue of the international funding that pooled into that country to begin with. So all these real life examples also still exist. But then secondly, how do you piss these countries off? How do you piss these countries that you are so reliant on? You piss them off because now they actively see this as an aggressive policy. How so? Three things here. Number one, no developed country had it in plan that, oh, this country is just going to end its economic ties with me, or reduce their economic ties with me to such a large extent. So they had no contingency plan in mind. That in itself is simply enough for them to be pissed off at your country to begin with and not provide you with the aid and anything that they do so in the current status quo. But secondly, also understand how this is the only thing you literally give them. The thing that primarily relies your relationship with them is your market, right? The only thing you give these developed countries is the market that your people have, right? So they can sell their goods here as well. At a point in time, you take away your market, you take away a huge bargaining chip that you used to have with these developed countries. That also reduces your role in the foreign spectrum. But then thirdly, also understand this charter of these international organizations, right? What is the impact on that charter, right? That charter probably talks about how you need to promote free trade, etc., for your countries to get these loans and aids, etc. At a point in time, you stop doing that. You also stop rolling over those types of loans for you. But then also understand why free trade is so important for these countries. The literal example of why free trade is so important for developed countries in the first go is because they literally set up so many international organizations to ensure that this free trade remains a concept and something that is supported to begin with. But what is then the impact here, right? The impact here is that you're probably, if you reduce your ties and have protectionist policies, your loans are going to be either recalled by these countries or they're just going to stop giving you more loans to begin with. What happens then? Probably you have no money and you're going to cry as a country on their side of the house, both in short term and in long term. So there's probably also going to be no assistance on their side as well. But then what does the developing world look like? The developing world is also very, very important because now you also need to maintain your ties with these developing countries. You need more South to South cooperation as well. At a point in time, you employ protectionist policies, you're going to actively ruin your relationship with these other developing countries as well. That is very, very problematic because these were countries you had, no power imbalances with, countries you had proper free trade with. And at a point in time, you ruin that. You also ruin the relationships that you garnered with these countries as well. You relied on them for beneficial trade agreements. You now also cannot support each other's economies. But moving on to my second line of argument here, how this weakens internal systems and industries and how that's so bad for consumers to begin with. But before that, sure, I'll take a POI.
Sir, please draw a long short-term comparative for your side.
Long-term, short-term comparison. Sure, I'll talk about that within this argument as well. On a short term, you literally do not have an industry that can sustain itself. On a long term, you do not have industries growing up because you did not have the money for those industries to grow up. You do not have the governance structures for these industries to grow up. So both in the short term and in the long term, you're going to fail because they can't come up and be like, oh, local industries are going to be so better. They're going to be so competitive. We're going to give you exact reasons within this argument. This argument is exactly on that, how this weakens internal systems and industries and how that's so bad for consumers. Listen here, understand the raised prices that are going to be a part of this as well, because now these local industries do not have competition from external markets. At a point in time, you don't have competition from external markets, you are going to increase your prices exponentially because you can do that. Your consumers do not have the alternative at their side of the house. But then also understand why this is going to remain, why they're not going to resort to fixed prices, because you have weak internal governance systems on their side of the house. Because these are developing countries with weak governance systems. At that point in time, we think these local economies are going to be shattered by these raised prices and these high inflation rates, etc. as well. But also, secondly, you have no incentives for better quality produce and innovation, right? Because you do not have any international market that you have to compete with actively. You do not have quality produce. How so? You do not rely on international quality standards because you do not go to international markets. But secondly, you lack the technology that those developed countries have that they traded with you. You stop that inflow. But thirdly, you also only like the rich families that do have the money to sustain those markets or industries are going to invest in that, and they're going to make sure their monopolies exist in these governmental structures of these countries that are easier for them to control now because you do not have external powers that are like actively mitigating that. But fourthly, government subsidies are also going to be lesser on their side because the government does not have enough funding to subsidize these resources to begin with because of the lack of funding that the government has. But also understand the lack of external assistance that you have on their side of the house. For all those reasons, we think we've taken this debate. Thank you.
Thank you for that lovely speech. I'd like to now call upon second proposition. Yeah, just give me a second. Am I visible and audible? Yep, you are. Okay, just give me a second. तो जैन तुम्हारा आर्गुमेंट किधर है? Okay. Yeah, I'll be starting in I'll be starting in three, two, one. Policy clarifications and the clashes within this debate. Not the only policy problem that they have with us is that you can't place taxes and subsidies at the same time. I think that's just like intuitively false because if you're placing taxes and tariffs on like imports and you're actively getting money that you can use to subsidize industries, that is a weird argumentation for them to run. Also, note they keep on like they're running on this characterization that developing countries right now they're literally on the verge of default and they have no access to any sort of money. That is not what like this debate is supposed to be about. This debate is supposed to be about developing countries and emerging economies like Pakistan, which do have access to like reserves and like some sort of wealth through which your economies are functioning, right? Because if they want to take the burden, if they want to place the burden on us that these economies aren't even functioning, then realistically, then free trade won't be benefiting you at all because you won't even have the money to import anything. You won't have the money to like convert your currency into the dollar to import anything. Those are the types of harms that then will also exist on their model. They can't debate this debate on those grounds, right? So I want to clarify something first, right? What do we care about within this debate, right? Or do we care about higher prices for consumers or ruining our relationships with like the developed world or development of industries, right? I think we care about development of industries significantly more, right? Why? Because higher prices for consumers and all of the harms that they point out are short-termist harms, right? And also I think they're catered to because no, the most vulnerable in your economies, they're never consuming imported goods, right? They're always consuming goods that exist within your economy currently. So, for example, the contextualization that my first speaker gave you about people who exist in like rural areas, they're like self-sufficient on their own, right? So they rely on things like their own agricultural production and selling that, right? So the most vulnerable in your economies are already catered to in our model, right? Because they're self-sufficient and they will never be reliant on imports. Because note the type of imports that come from the global north. These look like things like electronic equipment, plastic articles, etc. These are luxury type of consumer goods that like the rich class consume, right? So things like agriculture and like things like food that your poorest consumers consume, they will always be catered to. So I do not think we care about higher prices for consumers in the short run. I think secondly, we don't care about ruining our relationship with developed world because I think the global north is facing a huge amount of competition in the status quo. When you have alternative actors like the East Asian Tigers, you have other things like global South cooperation or like East cooperation. I think in the current status quo, the global north is decreasing in power. We don't care about them that much, right? On to the couple of clashes then. Firstly, will the developed country end its relationship with you and retaliate, right? I think no, right? Because no, what is the premise here? They say that the global north only relies on you for a market, right? I don't think that's true. I think they rely on you for a couple of other things as well. I think they rely on you to like make strategic ties and also vote for them in like these international conventions and international groups. I also think they rely on you for like military support, etc. I also think they rely on you for raw materials, right? Because no, we are not ending exports of developing countries in our model because protectionism applies to imports. Exports will always exist. And no, why is raw materials so important within this debate? Because raw materials, countries just can't create raw materials out of nowhere, right? So the global north do not have reserves of raw materials. They will always be reliant on these developing countries, right? Because you can develop industries, but you can't develop raw materials out of nowhere. So I don't think that idea is true. Let's give them like a couple of more responses to this because this is their main push within this debate, right? I don't think it's true because developed countries do it on their own as well. They also put protectionist measures in place. So if they try to retaliate against you, do you understand how bad their PR will be affected? Not in the current status quo, retaliation will ruin their image. Because in the current status quo, the world is becoming increasingly multipolar. Whereas these actors now have to face competition from BRICS. And like newsflash, BRICS is becoming actually really, really important because now you have new members within the BRICS. They own like 30% of like oil production and stuff. They have like 60% of your world's population. This is really, really important. Developed countries will never have an incentive to end ties with like countries like Pakistan. And considering this is their main push, they will never ever win this debate, right? But also note, in our worst case scenario, you'd end ties with them. I think it's about time. Because note, in every single state, whenever a developing country tries to do something, like you try to associate with China, you try to trade with Russia, because after the Russia-Ukraine war, you are still reliant on Russia for oil, the developed country and the global north will always have this looming threat over you. We think it's about time when you isolate, when you like move away from them and open yourself up to new opportunities opportunities and become more self-sufficient. Because otherwise, in the long term, will never ever be beneficial. No proven to you within this clash. In the short term, both sides will remain the same, right? In the short term, nothing, no change is realistically going to happen because the developed world won't end its relationships with you. But in the long term, these developing countries will be so much better off. And note, long term is really important because in the long term, I think it's getting really bleak for developing countries. Because in the current status quo, when you have debt racking for these countries, when you have greater politicization of trade, etc., when you have like these blocks forming, I think the long term for these developing countries is very bleak because you're literally going to default and you're literally going to end your life because the debt will continue to rack up and IMF will always remain an exploitative actor. So I do not think we care about the developed world as much as they claim. Second class then about development of industries, right? The only push that we get from them is that competition decreases and therefore that's really bad, right? Because consumers don't have like cheap prices, right? Couple of responses to this. My first response is that internal competition will always exist, right? Because when you have Oppo, you also have like Vivo, you also have other types of phones. The harm of competition from the developed world was such that they will all like global north was such is that they will always produce like cheaper goods, right? Because of the idea of colonial history that my first speaker talked about. This colonial history is really important because the colonial powers made it such that your economies would never be self-sufficient. Note the argumentation that they brought, that they tried to have monoculture economies. When Pakistan was only providing like spices, and then African countries were only providing like a specific crop. They made it so that your local industries were suppressed, and therefore the competition that comes from there, that comes from like 200 years of industrialization. That is something your local industries can never keep up with. Why is this so harmful? This is so harmful because of the idea of employment. Because note, even if consumers are worse off, I think consumers are less important than the people that you employ, your unskilled people that you employ, because you've already set up this contextualization that the type of goods that you import from these global north groups, etc., they're like luxury type goods, right? The most poorest and most vulnerable people are unskilled laborers who will never consume imports, right? They will all the vast majority of their consumption relies on like agricultural supplies. They don't consume electronic equipment. They do not consume plastic articles. For these reasons, I think internal competition will always exist. Because note, if you have like one industry racking up and making profit, basic economic state that another industry and another profit incentivized actor will also come up and rise, right? So therefore, I think competition will always exist on our side. But even if competition does not exist, I say we still win this debate because of the idea of employment, and employment is so important. Not what I've done here. I've explained to you that any of the stakeholders that they point out are simply not important within this debate, and their best case scenario in the long term, you will always be worse off. But one final argument, but one like final argument that I want to bring back because that was my first speaker's argument, and it's really important. That's being entrenched in the primary sector for like the future decades. Because note the idea of comparative advantage, right? Comparative advantage and free trade principles state that you should rely on specialization. When you rely on specialization, the global north will always produce more expensive goods and you will always produce cheaper goods. Why is this so harmful? Because of the ideas that they bring about. The ideas of debt and loan. Because note, the global north has constructed free trade ideology only to harm the developing world and make sure that they are under their control. Because they will always be reliant on you for debt. They will always be reliant on you for the IMF, etc. Because there will always be a trade deficit existing. This is so harmful because you can never have proper autonomy over your country and sovereignty. For all these reasons that have been proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for that fine speech and like to call upon second opposition.
Okay. Also, कैमरा किसने बंद किया था?
मैंने बंद किया था एक मिनट। उसको करना हो।
Okay. If everyone's ready, I'm just going to start.
I'm sorry, sir.
Sorry, my teammates are moving incessantly. Okay, okay, they have finally settled down. They make argumentation, which to me, for the most part, just sounds very petulant. Like, I won't call some of their argumentation untrue. Sure, the global north has set up the paradigm in a way that benefits it. Tell me something new. How does that justify or prove the motion for your side? I'm sure we all want to give it to the developed world personally, but we'll also get something else in the process which we don't want to get, and that is the burden that we're taking on in this debate. So when they talk about how the EU and the US practice protectionism, what I hear is, yes, there is a double standard, and yes, we have to deal with it. And I also hear a concession that for the most part, this protectionist model only works for countries which have already stockpiled resources, which have already a lot going on for them. So for instance, Germany can become very protectionist because they have BMWs that they can suddenly manufacture because they have the resources to do so. You do not have those resources to even diversify into these other industries in the first place. So that is not something you can claim for your side. Secondly, they concede that the global north has so many alternatives. In the next breath, they say that the global north does not have alternatives and they heavily depend on you. But let me talk about this idea of dependence of the global north on you, which is sweet, but ultimately it is a fallacy. Because firstly, they can always just invest in green technology, which there's already a push for through where international like climate protocols. Now you're just giving them another reason to actually do that and realize those goals. Secondly, they can always invest in nuclear power. With the right-wing wave across Europe, many countries in Europe are suddenly fine with like adopting nuclear power. Just like, for example, in France, there's an adoption of nuclear power. In Germany, there's an adoption of nuclear power. That's what Greta Thunberg was protesting, right? Thirdly, China has the South China Sea. So China for certain isn't going to be affected because they have like billions of tons of reserves. Fourthly, off the coast of North America, and you can look this up, there are also untapped resources that you can always use. So again, there's going to be no dependence on you from the global north. Let's stop talking about that. So then, where does the economy largely improve? That is my only clash within this debate, right? We say on our side, firstly, because debt can be rolled over from international organizations on our side of the house. You can see that the paradigm is such that free market trade is heavily prioritized in the world. These same paradigm also regularly roll over debt for you so that you don't default because you're abiding by their rules and you're carrying out those neoliberal policies. Now that you're no longer fitting under what they're telling you to do, they no longer have an incentive to roll over that debt and you're more likely to default. And here's the thing, right? We're fine with admitting that we're going to take on more debt because taking on more debt is always better than defaulting, where millions of your people die over a couple of years, right? I think that is always going to lose in the way up. They say that there's BRICS, right? And that is why you're going to have an incentive to still be nice to developing nations. I think BRICS doesn't really matter because it's supposed to be an economic union that is also based on countries trading with each other. Now that you're completely shifting the global paradigm and everyone is becoming a recluse into themselves, then all of these incentives of like IMF group versus BRICS group are going to suddenly dissipate anyways, right? Like the global north is going to more so focus on stockpiling resources through other means, and China is also going to focus on like investing in the South China Sea and oil reserves there. So like this isn't going to be a main concern for the developed world anymore. Secondly, I think on our side, you can get funds to develop yourself as a country. So I gave you an example of East Africa, where you develop surgical equipments through the help of international organizations and Western countries, right? You would have not gotten this if you suddenly became protectionist and started retaliating against them and trying to give it to them like they're doing on their side of the house. By creating this niche, they became a forerunner in a very unlikely industry that they perhaps could never have otherwise become a forerunner in. I think this sort of opportunity only exists on our side. Thirdly, I think there are beneficial trade deals on our side of the house with countries who are equal in the power dynamics. For example, South to South cooperation. You take away all of these very beneficial trade deals you can get just because you want to do everything on your own. I don't necessarily understand the benefit of it. So sure, I concede. There are certain luxury goods that are coming in, and I agree, they're perhaps not the most necessary. They are perhaps contributing to your trade deficit. But we believe it is absolutely worth what you get from these relationships that you have to sustain with the developed world, because ultimately you are still irrevocably dependent on them. But then we also question the interim period on their side of the house. What happens in the short term. Because if you say that these are agrarian economies, then I say capital machinery, the basic tools of your economy and how it works, coming in from outside. Then I say fertilizer, when you fall short of it and you're going through a crisis, it comes from outside. How are you going to deal with all of these discrepancies now that you want to do everything on your own? So when you say that the vulnerable person isn't going to be affected, I think that vulnerable person who lives in a village is absolutely going to be affected when you don't have enough food that is going to be reaching them, because your country isn't producing enough food, for instance, because you didn't think about what's going to happen in the short term. We're not fine with making this way up. We're not fine with making, like, I don't know, tens of millions of people starve because maybe 10 years into the future, we'll develop some like technological industry. Again, they don't give us any reason to believe this is going to happen. Their next claim is about product dumping. Firstly, I say this is a China-specific problem and not enough of a reason to completely cut yourself off from the rest of the world. You can just diversify your foreign relations. Secondly, I think even China has a vested interest with the Belt and Road Initiative to not completely cripple you with like product dumping, right? Sure, there are some examples of it happening, but by and large, it still wants to maintain goodwill for you, so it severely mitigates your impact, right? Thirdly, I think you also rob people of a lot more choice on the comparative. So we're fine even if you have to even if that guy Irfan in the north no longer can sell his own products like you say, right? I think at least he has the ability to choose between multiple different competitive products, whereas on your side of the house, you're limiting him to just one product that is produced by monopolies, right? So don't talk to me about colonial modes when you're also saying that MNCs are going to set up shop in your country, because I think that is going to lead to the same negative harms that you claim for our side. So if MNCs are supposedly setting up shop in your country, right, I think the money is still going to go outside of your country. Most of the skilled jobs are going to be taken by white people who they bring over to that country to work in the regional office, and perhaps there are going to be some unskilled jobs where you're still getting where you're still dirt poor people are working for very, very little pay. I think this is not a good enough impact to win you the debate. So do indigenous industries actually get developed on their side? This is a very good question, and I have 4 things here. Firstly, before that, sure, I'll take a point. Okay, you took too long.
Sir, don't you
Sorry.
believe
Yes,
US
I'm sorry, you took too long. You took way too long. Firstly, in terms of subsidies, like you say, I think they exist on our side as well. They're just more competitive to get on our side of the house. So you have to prove to the government that you have certain productivity, that you have efficiency, and then there's going to be a return on their investment. On your side of the house, they get highly complacent because you're handing out subsidies to everyone, as far as I can hear from your side of the house, right? Secondly, we think subsidies to develop local industries is very risky anyways because of bureaucratic inefficiencies and corruption. Certain companies which aren't as efficient might be lobbying the government to give them the subsidies, right? Furthermore, there's a great lack of research about the macroeconomy within these developing countries. So it's very easy to misprioritize these subsidies, and it's very, very risky to focus on risk everything on these local companies to be able to get your consumers what they want. Ultimately, if it falls short, like, you're not going to have alternatives coming in from outside. That's very risky. Thirdly, I think a lot of niches that developing countries have are developed in conjunction with organizations like the World Trade Organization, which are no longer on your side anymore. But fourthly and lastly, I think monopolies are going to form on your side, because just think about it intuitively. You have a guaranteed consumer base. You don't have as many resources because you are existing in a developing country. So you all band together and you create one very inefficient company that is always going to get resources from the government. That sounds like a win-win deal for you and a very bad deal for the Irfan you talk about in the north.
I thank that speaker for their speech, and I'd now like to call upon the third opposition.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I just have 30 seconds? All right, am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Perfect. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. Note how they try to recharacterize this debate to suit their needs. They try to make this debate about the lowest class of people and how they're going to be so much worse off. But we already gave you analysis which frames this out. The idea that these people are always going to be self-sufficient because they live in farms, because they live in areas that are agro-based, which means they're always going to create food that gives their needs. If the metric for that was that they simply don't starve, we think we take that because they are self-sufficient. We don't think this debate applies to the lowest class of people, but rather it applies to people who continue to do business. And was about MNCs and monopolies, right? We think that in this case, simply because you provide employment to these people, which I will be proving to you in my classes, we think we take this debate. But note, last thing on policy, exports will still continue to exist in this side of the house. This is because on their side, they're simply saying the existence of resources exist in other countries in the global north. But note, you need processing of those resources. You need to find those resources, build reserves, which is going to take 10 to 15 years at the minimum. We don't think this is time that the global north then has. At that point, a dependence for natural resources exists for these poorer countries on our side of the house. But then the first class in becoming about relations with other countries. Note how this is simply class that's not as important with this debate. The idea is that relations with other countries are simply something that is not as important to your country as industrial development. This is for a few reasons. Because relations exist when you have soft power and hard power within other areas within around the world. We don't think this is true simply because of the fact that these are developed expansion or incentives wherein they want to relations with unions simply don't benefit them as much as they benefit agents like, for example, the USA or UK. At that point in time, their incentive is simply not to promote regional cooperation or something like that. Because the only time they do that is when they want help in trading wars that they're impacted by because of global influence. This is the second thing then. On their side of the house, this regional cooperation they talk about has as worse harms as benefits. But note, there are no benefits from this other than the fact that you continue trade. We tell you to continue trade, which I will talk about later, but the idea is that you're always stuck in trading wars that these larger countries do. This looks like you're simply becoming a pawn in their actions because of the fact that whenever the US has a proxy war with any other nation, you literally have to abide by that. You can't make choices by yourself. You do not have any economic sovereignty on their side of the house simply because of the fact that these nations will always make you do what they want to do. They want to establish dominance. South-South cooperations only exist wherein you think that these countries are developed enough to continue trade with one another. The only trade that these countries then have is with raw materials. We think that itself does not develop these countries, but simply gives a facade that, hey, we have relations with these other countries. I think even in the absence of that, wherein your country is agrarian at the first place, you will continue to have that benefit that you so claim. But then this South-South cooperation literally does not even benefit these countries in the first place, wherein all of these countries are literally at the lowest social class of countries in the regional network. We don't think South-to-South cooperation benefits them in the first place. But then just say that, hey, you won't get loan and debt rollover. And this is really important, guys. The idea is you simply don't need loans wherein you're becoming self-sufficient. It's really important there. These countries are simply encroaching on your sovereignty time and time again because they believe that you do whatever they tell you to do. We think global south is simply more important than they're framing it out to be, right? Because for the global north, the only power that they have is if the global south listens to them. If the global south fails to do that, they have no power. At that point in time, they will continue to maintain relations with the global south simply because they want to assert a certain form of dominance. At that point in time, the IMF will give you a loan if you go for it. Maybe not simply come up to your door and say that, hey, please take a loan, simply because we think your economy is worse off. We think loans will continue to exist and your capacity to pay them back is much larger because you're not paying them back with loans from other countries, but rather from money that you generate with industries within your own country. At that point, I don't think the idea of relations with other countries is simply worse off. But then lastly, what do I need to tell you to win this debate? We think exports will continue to exist. Global North does not have the capacity to develop reserves and to continue to maintain their industries in the short amount of time that you're talking about. In the short term, the Global North will always continue to rely on the Global South for these resources. Your exports will continue in this time because they simply don't have the time to do that. At that point in time, in the short term, when you say the Global South is suffering and they don't have money, you're always going to get money from the Global North through exports and even through taxes when they give products to your country. Even then, if they don't give you products, we think they will come into your country, they will establish their businesses there, money that you continue to earn. We think this project is simply going to be funded by the country themselves and not going to be exploited. Why we take this clash? Before my second clash of points, sure. Seeing that there are none, moving on to my clash, moving to my second clash about where will our country's industries then be better off? Because no, very one-liner refutation to this idea, right? They say product dumping does not exist because it's only relevant to China. China in itself is as important of an actor as any other global superpower. They're getting more and more power in the status quo analysis my second speaker gave you regarding simply as is happening in the current status quo. Temu recently launched within Pakistan. That means every single influencer you know is buying billions of products from Temu. That means that China is going to continue to product dump into your country. Even if it's not China, it's going to be someplace like Japan. It's going to be any other country that is going to use your market and not grant you any benefit from that. We think this is something you should literally take away, something they never cater to. Product dumping will always continue to exist. But what does the long term then look like through product dumping? Even if it's just China, it's going to expand and many other countries are going to sell products that are cheaper and cheaper. So for example, first you had Shein selling in Pakistan, now you have Temu. This literally looks like your market being exploited in the long run, something we don't think is something that should exist on your side of the house. But then secondly, they say your country will literally default in the short term. I don't think that's true. Countries don't default simply because they implement protectionist policies, guys. Because note, this is simply about your imports and your exports. That is what protectionism relates to. Your country has all its other major businesses functioning. Your country still has remittances and other things still existing within this place. And we don't think that this impacts your economy to that large of an extent wherein you simply go out and default. We think you default when you simply don't have the capacity to generate any money. That exists wherein foreign actors invade your economic sovereignty and enter your country and exploit it to the extent that you can't generate anything anymore and then leave. We think you always have a safety net against that in our side of the house, something they don't prove to you. But then lastly, they say that people are going to starve and they're never going to be self-sufficient. I don't think this is true for a variety of reasons, because the characterization of this thing is that it exists within a crisis. Within a crisis, you don't have the ability to export anymore. At that point in time in our model, wherein you could simply have a backup in the form of resources that your country is producing on their side of the house, you never have a safety net. This is because you import in the form of converting to the dollar. That's money that you simply always wash out on their side of the house, something that we don't then do. On those grounds, in a crisis, you always have to revert to importing in the basis of a dollar, something that you can't afford, something wherein your country will literally default on their side of the house. We think we always have a safety net against that, wherein you're reducing your reliance on the dollar then, wherein you're creating income within your country, providing employment to these people. But even then, the last argument that stands is the idea of a niche existing. We think the niche in itself is not something that's as beneficial, because the niche for these countries will always and always be things like wheat, things like grass, simply things that are agrarian and agro-based in the first place. That is not something that we want on those ground proposition.
Thank you for that lovely speech. Now to wrap up with a stantive from opposition, third op.
Can I have 30 seconds? Am I visible?
Yes, you are.
Yep.
Okay. If I stop speaking mid-speech, it's because my throat died. Could you guys like pause the time?
Of course, don't worry about it.
I have two problems with their case. Firstly, notice when they try to rebut this entire idea that we talked to you about how, South to South cooperation is a pretty good thing. Their response is pretty important. They come up and tell you, no, guys, they can only trade in raw materials, and raw materials aren't enough to sustain your country, and you need to, do bigger and better things. But what's their case? Oh no, these are countries with primary production and only raw materials, and apparently when we go complete protectionism mode, we will suddenly save the economy. On their side, they're also talking about raw materials turning into finished goods somehow magically, but apparently when it's on our side, that is something that just apparently doesn't work. So I don't know then what they're talking about. But secondly, notice how like Sophia and like all of the entire basically team just completely ignore what imports etc even look like in the status quo. They like just say, oh no, these are just luxury goods in a lot of instances etc, and this doesn't matter. But notice how this goes against their own context of this debate. Here's the thing, they talk about these countries being entirely primary production focus, like focusing on entirely primary production. So this likes you having raw materials etc only. And unfortunately, I'd like to think developing countries aren't primitive civilizations, and we don't just eat berries on the floor every day. We probably need manufactured goods etc. So a lot of times the things that you're importing in those instances are things that you need to survive. This looks like etc, and this is like something that they come up and talking about dumping etc. You need finished products etc to even survive for these people etc. You need clothes etc from outside. You need those manufactured goods that come in. These aren't just luxury products in a lot of instances. They're basic necessities. The tractor, the capital machinery that you require to build those like factories etc that they want to talk about. The ideas about manufacturing etc, they can't function without capital machinery. But also basic necessities like this pen for me to write with, a lot of like I don't know, this bottle or something. Like in a lot of instances you need those sort of like imported goods to even survive. These are not luxury products but bare necessities in a lot of instances. Two issues in this debate then. Firstly, like actually one issue, overlying issue, which is where are developing countries going to be better off. But first issue with the issue, where are like your internal economy is going to be better off. I think like I wanted to talk about something here. Notice how they completely ignore this entire idea that we brought to you about competition. And this is something that they concede. Competition is something that exists on their side, but apparently it's bad on their side because of some reason like dumping etc. We told you dumping is something that's China specific. You can just diversify your options etc. But also in a lot of instances, I think the problem is things like competition etc are good because it makes better products and services. So you have to compete with bigger businesses that are probably more experienced to make sure people buy your products etc. In those instances, so you actually have products that you can end up exporting etc, or even sell to your own population that are worthwhile having. But secondly, I think competition is good for pricing. Notice what's something really important about developing countries. People are kind of poor. People don't have a lot of capacity. They can't survive on expensive products, like just being sold. The problem with you not having any sort of competition is that businesses can continue raising prices however they feel like because they have no other opposition to running them. So they can raise prices because they know people are dependent only on them. They can't import any of their products, so they have to buy their own products so they can raise prices as much as they want. In that instance, you are harming the individuals that live in these countries. These are extremely important individuals. Sure, maybe not all of them live on farms, but we are going through one of the worst recessions in this country. This country is on the brink of defaulting. A lot of people don't have shelters, food, etc. right now. You can't force them to just be oh no, big deal or something like that on their side. But also this harms exports on their side. I think businesses get complacent and you don't have products good enough to even export on their side. But I think secondly, this is their entire idea about subsidies that they try to talk to you about. I think the problem with subsidies is we can also have them. They're not just exclusive to this idea of protectionism. But on their side, subsidies are going to be far worse off because these are assured to be coming to these sort of like local businesses, etc. So they get complacent in a lot of instances because they're like, oh, we're going to get subsidies either way. We don't need to evolve our business as much as they want. But on our side, you have competition with other businesses, which means you have to actually use those subsidies to do something good with your business and actually improve the quality of that business. So our subsidies on our side are also much more better off. But this is also something that's pretty insane. They talk to you about how, a lot of times local products only have one problem, and that's the image problem. They're pretty well off in quality. I think the problem is it relies on the assumption that products will be cheaper off, which I've already disproven. But secondly, I think that idea of an image problem also goes down if this is their best case, if the prices go down. I think you then don't associate with them with the same level of luxury that they want to talk about. I think that's something that doesn't happen on their side. We told you about how protectionism doesn't work, but look, notice something really, really important here. I think in a lot of instances, like because of the political instability and generally the bureaucratic structures that exist in developing countries, a lot of times these protectionist policies don't tend to work. You know what tends to happen? So you're going to have like a blanket protectionism policy, but then people start to whine because for justified reasons, because they don't want to die hungry, and then you need to import things like wheat, etc. So you like make a caveat for wheat, etc. And then you start to make a lot of caveats, and that policy in itself starts to become ineffective. So you block some things, but you don't block others, and there's no then meaningful impact that exists on proposition side. That's what tends to like happen. So it's a lose-lose situation where you're blocking something, then blocking like others. The problem is if you get like I think on their side you limit people from access basic necessities, because fun fact, Pakistan doesn't just import random things, it also needs to import things like wheat, etc. from India to even have its people survive on food, etc. That is something that's just basically a fact. But before I move on, sure,
Wherein businessmen will always exist in these countries that want profit, don't you think businesses will eventually always succeed?
businesses will want profit, but guess what happens? They know there's no other competition. They know that they don't have to compete with other businesses, so they don't have to care about improving their products, but they also don't have to care about making sure that prices are competitive, because guess what? There's no competition. Please engage with that. But also, this is like another practical attack that they have. Oh no, apparently it's bad when your economy is only focused on one thing and it's specialized on only on one thing for some colonial narrative reason. I don't know what that means. Like I'm genuinely confused what they want to talk about here, but I'm going to tell you why that's still a good thing. I think in a lot of instances when countries are are specialized in one form of business, that means other countries are dependent on them, etc. as well. So US can fundamentally cut off relations with Pakistan anytime they want, because you have to then develop those free trade industries, etc. So you're not always cut off. So if they want an economy where everything is just working completely fine, you're just doing a bit of everything, other countries just cut you off and then switch markets, etc. But I don't get what's the exclusive problem with primary industries that they talk about. I think other than that, I'm going to talk to you about where relationships with other countries are then going to be better off. I think this is where they don't engage with this at all. We told you your relationship with the developed world is going to be far worse off because of a couple of reasons. A, you already have established trade relationship with these countries, so when you just randomly cut off one day, that's not going to be something that they take pretty pleasantly. I think even a lot of instances, even if they are invested in you and they have a lot of reason to incentives to care about you, what ends up happening is to show force, and this is what they say, assert dominance. You will probably want to sanction them, etc. for a period of time, so other countries don't end up blocking you, etc. So other developing countries don't end up cutting off their trade relationship, etc. So you countries do end up getting harmed. But I also just think international charters, etc., like the IMF or the World Trade Organization, also have generally ideas about neoliberal trade policies and free trade and all of that stuff. The problem with that is you can't just magically turn your economy into a reclusive economy, or even ideas like BRICS, etc., and not trade with other countries and imagine these countries will still give you debt. The problem is, unfortunately, Pakistan is on the verge of defaulting. Unfortunately, even if we don't take any more loans, 73% of our economy is debt ridden. We can't just magically be like, oh no, we don't care about loans, because we have to care about loans. We have to repay back them. We have to have our debt forgiven somehow. They can't just magically come and say, oh no, that's going to be fine on their side of the house. Notice what they say about MNCs. They want to apparently, but also MNCs goes against their entire policy, etc. as well. If they want to protect the economy of this country, then they shouldn't allow MNCs to set up shop here, because most of that benefit ends up going to the other country, the host country. So I don't know how MNCs are benefiting the local economy as well. But I also think that MNC in the sector won't set up shop here precisely because of that very reason, because in a lot of instances you'll probably put restrictions, etc. on them, so they can't even talk about that benefit. They won't get employment on their side. A lot of people will start to die, because guess what? You need your loans forgiven. Your country's on the edge of defaulting. You need to make sure that your people can survive.
I thank the speaker for that speech, and now to wrap up the debate from opposition side, I'll reply.
Okay. Can I start? people who are so vulnerable and
Yeah, I heard like people who are so vulnerable and then he dropped.
Yeah. Okay.
did I leave the meeting?
Yes, you did. You
Yeah,
hadn't
like,
started yet.
yeah, we heard 2 words and then you vanished.
Okay, okay. I thought you guys were just like so starstruck. You were like you froze for a second.
Shazreen is back.
Okay.
Is she?
Yes, I am. Let me get the timer back open.
Chalo, before like other participants just start vanishing, let's quickly. Guys, अपने अब तक के decisions मुझे message कर देना if you guys are vanishing, like मतलब.
Then I'll set up.
Okay. Can I start?
No, wait. Westminster speaker not.
Okay. Oh.
Everything good?
Apparently not. We couldn't hear you. If you said something, we couldn't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Sorry, I was saying to the Westminster team, beach mein their thingy glowed. So I was saying to them, कि
अच्छा,
you can hear them. You are audible, visible, everything is good.
ठीक है. I'm just waiting for your guys' cue.
Best.
Okay, yes, we can hear you guys now. We can start.
Okay, Westminster, था, ठीक है, great. I think everyone is ready now.
Okay. So I guess I will actually start now.
Shazreen, you have the stopwatch thing ready?
Yeah. They claim to help various Irfans, various Bilals. They all tend to originate from some rural background. These nameless, faceless people who are so vulnerable and so much better off on their side. Let me tell you a fact about Irfan. Those cheap clothes from China are why he and his children have clothes on their back when it's winter time, right? So you, a government with historically corrupt bureaucracies, claim that you will use his taxpayer money to allot subsidies to the right companies when you have previously not done so in the past, when you've given us no reason to suggest that you have the ample research, that you know enough about your own macroeconomy to make these decisions. And when wheat falls short, when fertilizer falls short, when Irfan and his children don't have any food, well, at least we liberated ourselves from these colonial modes, right? Congratulations, everyone. By third, note that they've committed the ultimate sin in world schools debating. They've gone all negative at proposition. All of their impacts and catastrophization comes down to a single, very tenuous premise that indigenous industries are actually likely to be developed on their side of the house. This is what they spend the least time on, interestingly enough. Let me tell you a few reasons why they don't prove this and therefore don't fulfill their burden in this debate. Firstly, initially, they missed the mark by talking about MNCs. We point out that this just makes them more dependent on colonial modes, and this is effectively dropped throughout the debate. Secondly, we tell you that indigenous industries need capital machinery and they need tools to make their businesses work, right? So perhaps if previously there were extractive industries which you didn't get much of a cut off, but still some sort of cut, right? Now you're not going to get any cut because you're not going to have those industries, because those companies, when they left, they took all their tools with them, guys. Furthermore, the internal shortages you don't account for are still a looming question in this debate. Thirdly, we have competition on our side of the house. Note that they don't refute our point on monopolies. That when everyone in the developing country is short a bit on resources in terms of starting a business, but they all know that they're going to have a guaranteed consumer base once they start one, right? They're all going to band together, get the subsidies from the government, and form one big bad company which makes the worst quality products and which makes people like Irfan very unhappy. Fourthly, inflation is already already high because you're a transitional economy. So domestic consumers aren't going to be enough to keep these indigenous industries growing. Presumably, you're going to export to other countries, right? And this is where our idea about how protectionism is only built for developed countries comes in. Because a country like Germany can manufacture cars and then sell them to the rest of the world and become prosperous. But you're not going to be making these very technologically advanced capital products, right? But at the same time, other countries are retaliating against you because you said these relationships aren't important and you can just sustain yourself. At the end of the debate, you've taken a terrible burden where you're supposed to keep indigenous companies going without either internal consumers because the inflation is too high, or external consumers because you don't need them, right? Fifthly, then, I think you also need their money to develop. We gave you numerous case studies, including those in East Africa, where you can actually have free trade and at the same time expand niches that can ultimately make your economy better. Absolutely no response throughout the debate. The last looming question is whether these developed countries actually depend on you and whether they're going to be able to assert their dominance anymore. I think, sure, they do want to assert their dominance, right? You know how they do it? By not bending back over for you, by not letting you win, because they know that ultimately you still owe loans to them. And this is something very interesting they say, right? They say, when you become self-sufficient in the long term, you will no longer owe loans to these countries. But what about the loans which you already owe, the loans which you need for them to roll over to pay back? Note that if this is their only response, they absolutely lose because they concede that in the short term, you're going to default as a country. So I don't really care what you do in the long term, insofar as Irfan is dead and his children are also dead. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. And now to wrap up the debate from the proposition side and the debate as a whole, proposition reply.
Oh yeah, I'll be starting my speech in. Okay, I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Irfan's father had a shop. They used to make like clothes together. And then Irfan used to sell this, and that's how his family made any sort of income. Because note what Ali Nasser is relying upon right now. That Irfan already has like money and reserves sitting somewhere. That's why, having multiple products and multiple competitive industries is so important. But the point of matter is that if Irfan does not have access to money and access to employment, he will never be a consumer because he does not have the capacity to consume if you do not have disposable income. This is the point at which they lose this debate, because note, what did we tell you? We told you in the vast majority of situations, people who live in rural areas and ruralized areas, they usually tend to be self-sufficient, right? Why? Because they don't really consume that much, and they don't want to consume luxury products because that is completely out of their income bracket, right? So in the vast majority of situations, Irfan is not buying things like Gucci, like shirts and sweats, and like Chinese shirts, etc. But he's probably gonna like wear what his father wore, right? Or like his mother is like making clothes and sewing clothes, right? That is the current status quo of developing countries, and that they do not engage with, right? What else do I want to clarify before I get into the clashes within this debate? Note that they've conceded to the long term, right? Because they do not have any positive argumentation as to why the long term would be better off in their model. And note, free trade claims that the long term will be better off, but they give us no argumentation as to how it will be better off. So the only thing I'm going to prove in this, the only thing I need to prove is that the short term is survivable, right? Let's prove to you why the short term is survival. The first thing that I want to frame within this is that if they want to frame developing countries and like countries like Pakistan and the East Asian tigers as countries that are literally on the verge of default, then their model is not sustainable as well. Because what did we tell you? We tell you import on the dollar. You need to convert your currency in the dollar. That is not affordable for you. So their model is not sustainable as well. And this is not something that we brought in like prop reply. We brought this in second prop and third prop. They did not engage with it. This is the biggest strategic mishap that they could have made, because their own model is not sustainable on the characterization that they run, right? So why will developed world not end ties with you? We gave you a couple of responses. Firstly, the raw material idea, right? And what was Ali Nasser's reply? They're not reliant on you. They can like develop their own industries. But no, they have a problem with our short term. So developed world short term does not matter. And we tell you that they're going to take like 10 to 15 years to develop this, right? And it's going to be problematic because your access to raw materials is completely finished if you choose to end ties
with them, right? You have no access to those because you were completely reliant on the developing world for raw materials. In our model, the short term is different because at the end of the day, they fail to recognize that in developing countries, you still have industries existing and alternative products existing, right? So in that situation, they just don't win this debate because if the short term is so important for them, then obviously like developing countries will trade with you, right? But we gave you other reasons why they won't end relationships with you. This was not the only reason. We told you military alliances, strategic alliances, having hard power. These are all incentives that the global north has. We also told you that the BRICS exist, therefore the world is becoming more multipolar, right? They have an incentive to not ruin those relationships with you. And the fourth thing we told you is like IMF and all these regional bodies, they have an incentive to make sure that you participate in their function and system, right? Because not if they end ties with all developing countries, because not all developing countries are going to institute protectionism. They end ties with all developing countries. Yeah, they're not going to function because the IMF gives loans to who? The developed world? No, developing countries. That is how they function, right? I think this is fairly intuitive analysis that proves that short term is survivable, right? But not to the long term that we've already taken. The only thing they tell us is monopoly, right? Monopoly is going to exist in two, monopolies can be in two ways. One is going to be good monopolies, and we're willing for those to exist if they're good. But if they're bad monopolies that are not functioning well and they're not competitive, I think it's basic economics. Other industries will rise up because you always have an incentive to make profit. This was their only engagement that we got on the long term. What were our argumentations then? Creating employment, creating things like, leaving the primary sector, because in their model, because of free trade and comparative advantage principles, you will always be primary sector, you will always be reliant on the primary sector. For all these reasons, clear proposition win.
Thank you for that speech. I thank all the debaters for all of their wonderful speeches, and I request that you leave the breakout room while the judges and I deliberate.